Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. Okay, so the item I want to talk about, I'm tempted to talk about the Apple search engine thing because it ties into what I'm going to talk about. Just real briefly, Eddie Q of Apple testified at Google's antitrust trial. No, we're not interested in building a search engine. Working with Google's the best. We didn't want to work with Bing because they weren't as good as Google. Then there were articles that came out about Apple never wanted to build a search engine. That was just not interesting to them. They didn't see any purpose to it. So we got that stuff. And then Mark Gurman, who's a very knowledgeable Apple watcher for many years and writes from Bloomberg now, and does this Apple-specific newsletter, comes out and says Apple always contemplated building a search engine, and they just have been building pieces of this. And he cited a number of different examples: an internal secret project called Pegasus, Spotlight, Google's ads platform, search ads platform, and the size of the search team within Apple as evidence that they were serious about search, and they may still someday launch a search engine, which is just sort of funny to me because the talk of Apple's search engine won't die, it seems. And the way that ties into what I'm going to talk about is that was one of the things that was asked about on a survey from an organization called the Data for Progress, which is an advocacy group that advocates regulating big tech companies. But they asked a survey of U.S. voters, and they broke it out by party affiliation as well as demographics. Basically, do you use Google? How often do you use Google? How long have you been using Google? Do you think that the ads are valuable? Are there too many ads? And if Apple had a search engine, would you use it? And you can go back and look at the item in the newsletter this week if you want to see the specific scores. But basically what it says is that 80% of people are regular Google users, and they've been using Google for more than 5 years. So you've got long-term, regular, daily Google users. But 60% of those people are concerned about privacy, and almost half think that the ads are useless, and a substantial minority think that there are too many ads. 50% of the audience thinks just the right amount, the Goldilocks number of ads, just right, and think that ads are mostly useful. So half of Google's audience is pretty satisfied, it seems, and then the other half is not. And then to the question about whether people would be likely, was the language, would you be likely to try an Apple search engine? If Apple introduced a new search engine to compete with Google, how likely or unlikely would you be to try it? And the likely total, which includes very likely, somewhat likely, is 58%, almost 60%, almost the same number that said they were concerned about privacy. And the very unlikely group is 35%, which is the Google loyalists. That seems to me to be the hardcore Google audience. So
it also reflects hardware distribution to some extent when you add Macs and iPhones. Roughly 60% of the U.S. audience is going to be interactive. I mean,
Android users are pretty loyal to Google, I think, and using all the Google services. iPhone users maybe a little bit less so, but it shows.
I would say a couple of things though, Greg. As we've discussed many times with the Chat GPT, Bing GPT scenario, there's a huge difference between open to trying and actually switching, right? Like,
absolutely, that's the need.
To me, that 60% number seems very low to me. Like, if Apple's actually going to succeed with this, they need 95% of people willing to try it and 20% of people actually switching, right? And that's a massive difference in terms of these. Once you've been habituated for 5 years of using Google, like, it takes a lot to break that habit. So even if it's a default search engine on the iPhone. So
right, but that's the point that they're making in the trial this week, is that defaults are very powerful. That the only way to achieve scale, and Bing said this, was the only way that they could ever get as good as Google was if they had the scale of being the Apple default that would have enough data that they could actually achieve parity. So default is a pretty powerful word or function in this context.
Yeah, I mean, it emerges not just as some sort of open market negotiation, it emerges as a very shrewd strategy on Google's part, both to acquire data and to block competitors from achieving the same level of data access that would allow them to build parity or comparative quality. I don't dispute anything that you're saying, David, about the habitual behavior versus, it's the difference between what people say and what they do. People say stuff all the time to surveys, and then their behavior is very different. So that's not something that I'm disputing at all. I just think it's a reflection of satisfaction with the product and how people feel about the company. It's an interesting snapshot because you've got a pretty substantial group of people who are not entirely happy with everything that Google is doing or the number of ads or finds the ads useful, but they aren't necessarily going to make any changes as you suggest because it's familiar to them, they're habituated to it. And that was the Neva complaint out the door when they sold to Snowflake, is that you know we couldn't even get people to try it. It was easier to convert people who tried it to paid customers than it was to get people to try it. And, inertia and habitual behavior are very powerful things. I just think it's interesting because, once upon a time, I think Google was a beloved company. That's no longer true. And there's a lot of dirt coming out about their behavior at the trial, which makes them look even worse. And a lot of SEOs are very, very jaded about Google. The behavioral signals thing that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Everybody. I wrote a post about that on LinkedIn, and it got a huge number of views. And a lot of people came in and said, "Oh, this is not news. We knew this. We always knew this. We had the data." There's just a lot of people who don't believe what Google's saying, don't take them at face value, and yet we're compelled.
Good. I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, we're compelled to use it, right? We're compelled to do all these things because of its dominant position in the market. And people increasingly dislike Google, dislike its behavior, but don't really have viable alternatives. That's the point, and to some degree that's the point of the antitrust trial. It looks, for all intents and purposes, like a very competitive marketplace, but in reality it's not. So,
well, I think, just as an aside, by far the least important data point in terms of the outcome of the trial. But I think it would be great for the SEO industry if there were another actual search engine that you had to pay attention to. It would mean, I think right now we've all sort of gotten lazy. Like, we know what the Google ranking signals are, and we know exactly what to do. And if there's another search engine that's siphoning off 20% of traffic or 50% of traffic that you actually have to pay attention to, I think that's going to benefit the agencies who are putting in the work and the companies who are putting in the work to understand this other search engine and all of the consumer behavior that goes along with that other search engine.
I mean, as I've said many times before, I think eventually there is going to be some virtual assistant GPT LLM driven search experience that has meaningful usage. I mean, at the Google hardware event this week, I wrote about this. The Google is basically turning Bard into the back end of Google Assistant. They combine the groups. They are moving. That's what it's going to be. It'll be a front end with the branding of Google Assistant, and Bard will be the back end. And I think that's very, very interesting. And the demo, sort of the presentation that they gave, there was nothing really that new except that Bard is being incorporated into the assistant. But the way that they speak about it is that it's a broader utility than search. It's a you get the Google Workspace stuff. There's a lot of personalization features. Plus you get search. Plus you get whatever conversational capabilities that it has. And I think that that's the inevitable direction of search, where some number of people start to use something like that, whether it's in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, that is different from what we know today in the Google sort of SERP. I think there's a kind of inevitability that's going to develop from that.
An interesting correlation to that is Google's announcements of these new Pixel phones getting 7 years of updates, and of Chrome now getting more years of updates. These are the true Google lovers, right? And if they're bringing search through Bard into the productivity apps, that's sort of a core that is not attackable through a core of users that's not easily attackable through an antitrust sort of context. So while their search engine may be forced to be less abusive of buying default positions, it's unlikely that they could be disabused of having default Bard in the context of Chrome and Pixel, which they've demonstrated they're going to go for longer periods of time with those.
Right.
That
it's a core piece of functionality.
Core piece of functionality to their core customers.
Sort of back to Apple for one sort of final second. One potential outcome of the trial is that the default deal gets canceled. That this
which harms Apple, not Google. I mean, that's the funny thing.
Well, like, it does.
All you're doing
is
hurt. Taking money out of Apple's pocket. People are.
That's right. It does hurt. It does hurt Apple because people will just keep using Google, and Apple won't get the money. But I mean, what's interesting there, and what the point that I think Mark Gurman made this point in his article is, if that happens, or maybe he didn't make it, and I am thinking he did. If that happens, does Apple become motivated to do something with search where they're going to monetize it with ads in order to compensate for the loss of revenue, which he claims is $8 billion and other people say is $15 billion annually.
Which the judge says he may actually divulge if it becomes a critical leverage point in the trial. So we may finally learn what the number is.
Yeah. That would be interesting to know. It would be very interesting to know.
Although I think it's a stacked number. I think it's a core payment plus a percentage of the ads
revenue.
Ad revenue.
Yeah. So Apple's rooting for Google to do all this behind the scenes manipulations in order to juice their search ad revenue.
But Apple, and one other note on Apple, they've long had the habit of saying, "Oh no, we're never going to do that," and then the next year they do it, right? Whether it's a cell phone or something else. And so it's not unusual for Apple to say, no, we've never been interested in doing this. They probably haven't. But then again, the incentives haven't been favorable for them. So
well, and they have something of an opportunity. They're allegedly spending millions of dollars a day on training large language models. And they could create a sort of a new type of search experience built around, this sort of GPT world that we're evolving into.
Did you say evolving or devolving?
It could be either one. Take your pick. Well, I mean, we'll leave that for another time because we're out of time today. But
that's a special 4-part. That's going to be a special 4-part Near Memo. Is there a D in front of that word or not?
Yeah, we'll be conjugating verbs next time on the Near Memo. We'll be exploring the Old English strong verbs that have ending changes, inflected endings, and things like that. The transition from Middle English to Modern English will be taken up on the next Near Memo. Anyway, thanks again, everybody, for listening. We'll be back next week. And as always, tell your friends, give us feedback. And thank you for your time.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.